This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Now, South Korea's president vows to push for a U.S. tariff deal as his top trade negotiator jets back to Washington for crunch talks. We've got details of Lee Jae-myung's first media briefing since taking office. Now, over in Japan, all eyes are on whether the ruling LDP-led bloc can maintain its majority as campaigning begins for the upper house election. A top Chinese diplomat Wang Yi heads to Germany for high-stakes talks, following his firm message to his EU counterpart that they are partners, not rivals. Well, the US lifts restrictions on exports to China for chip design software in a further sign of easing trade tensions. Ahead on East Asia tonight, recent U.S. and Israel strikes against Iran's atomic program and war machinery has sent Tehran scrambling. What do these events mean for its close ally, the nuclear-armed North Korea? We speak to an expert. And as Japan welcomes record numbers of visitors, cracks are starting to show, with locals increasingly complaining of overtourism. Can Japan still double its visitor count to welcome 60 million travelers annually by 2030? A South Korean President Lee Jae-myung says that his administration is doing its best to reach a tariff deal with the U.S. as Seoul's top negotiator heads to Washington again this weekend for talks. Mr. Lee held his first media conference to mark 30 days in office on Thursday. And CNA's senior Korea correspondent Lim Yeon-suk has more.
The media conference was held at the presidential Blue House where former South Korean presidents worked and lived before previous leader Yoon Suk-yeol moved to Yongsan. Since taking office a month ago, President Lee Jae-myung has been working to stabilize the country, which was thrown into chaos by his predecessor's martial law declaration last December and subsequent impeachment. Speaking to reporters on Thursday, Mr. Lee again called on Parliament to swiftly pass his $14.7 billion spending plan, part of a bold fiscal policy aimed at economic recovery. He also said tariff negotiations with the United States have been challenging, adding that it's unclear if an agreement is possible by Washington's July 8th deadline.
최대 현안 중 하나인 한미 통상 협상 또한 국익 중심의 실용 외교의 원칙을 바탕으로 호혜적이고 상생 가능한 결과 도출에 최선을 다하고 있습니다.
Touching on North Korea, President Lee reiterated his stance that he would seek dialogue with North Korea, vowing to take a pragmatic approach to foreign policy.
굳건한 한미 동맹과 긴밀한 한미 일 협력 그리고 조속한 중러 관계 개선을 바탕으로 국익 중심 실용 외교를 통해 평화도 국민의 삶도 지켜가겠습니다.
Mr. Lee did not give details as to how he is going to restart talks with North Korea, which has named South Korea its enemy. But he said peace with Pyongyang is not only about national security, but a crucial part of a virtuous cycle of peace and economic growth, and that it is foolish to completely cut off dialogue. Reaction was divided in Parliament. The ruling party said President Lee showed strong resolve to communicate openly with the public and expressed hope that he can unify the country. But the opposition party criticized the press conference as an embarrassing display of self-congratulation, adding that he has achieved little so far, especially on the critical tariff talks with the U.S. Lim Yeon-suk, CNA, Seoul.
Staying in South Korea, the parliament today has approved a revision to the rules governing martial law. And this comes 7 months after former President Yoon Suk-yeol shocked the country by declaring the move. New rules include banning the military and police from entering the National Assembly without approval and barring attempts to prevent lawmakers from entering the National Assembly. Now, if you recall, there were scuffles between lawmakers and soldiers deployed to block their access to the parliament on the night of 3rd December, when the martial law was declared. Now, they managed to break through the cordon and voted to void the declaration. Now, ex-President Yoon Suk-yeol, who was ousted as a result of that martial law declaration, will attend a second round of questioning this Saturday. Now, the questioning is part of an ongoing special counsel investigation into alleged insurrection and abuse of power. He failed to appear earlier in the week, citing health issues and preparations for a separate criminal trial. Yoon is facing a slew of legal woes owing to his declaration of martial law last year. And the decision threw the country into political turmoil and led to his ouster. His lawyer says Yoon will take part in the questioning. The probe, led by a team of about 200 investigators, is likely to go on until the end of the year. China has warned the EU against confrontation, saying the two sides are partners, not rivals. Foreign Minister Wang Yi told Europe's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, that none of the bloc's challenges were caused by China. The two leaders met in Brussels yesterday, and Ms. Kallas had said that China and the EU's security relationship was under increasing strain. The top Chinese diplomat heads to Germany for a security dialogue later today and France after that. His Europe visits come about 3 weeks before a summit between the Chinese president and top EU officials. And for more, we are joined now by Ross Cullen in Paris. Ross, so tell us, what can we expect for the China-Germany talks happening later today?
Yeah, that's right, Telly. It's stop number 2, country number 2 for the Chinese foreign minister on his tour of Europe, off to Germany on Thursday to meet the German foreign minister. Now, this is a meeting of economic heavyweights, the number 2 and number 3 economies in the world. And so the exports between both countries, computers and batteries coming this way to Europe, and machinery and motor vehicles going the other way to China from Germany will certainly be part of that conversation as well. And they are getting the chance now to meet these two key drivers in the EU. We've had the EU overall meetings on Wednesday, then meeting Germany, then meeting France in that order. So a chance really to understand the new German government's position when it comes to China going forward. We have a new chancellor in place with the new sets of priorities potentially from what China was used to dealing with under Olaf Scholz last year. You might remember the German chancellor made a trip to China in April 2024. So watching to see the new China-Germany relationship, particularly when it comes to foreign policy today.
So Ross, let's talk about yesterday then. We heard the Chinese leader basically saying that China and EU are partners, not rivals. Curious to know, how did that show up in his meetings with the European leaders in Brussels?
Yeah, 2 key meetings. The European Council President Antonio Costa was the first person to meet Wang Yi, and then he went on to meet Kaja Kallas, his counterpart, the EU's top foreign affairs official, the High Representative for International Relations. And she was particularly tough in some of the opinions that she was voicing to the Chinese foreign minister on Taiwan, saying that the EU stands in opposition to any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force or coercion. On Ukraine, accusing Chinese companies of supporting Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, saying that those Chinese companies are a security threat to Europe. Also on human rights, pressing the Chinese foreign minister, saying that there needs to be more done. The EU has concerns about human rights in China, and also saying that there are cyber security threats coming to Europe from China as well. So she was really trying to put forward that point of view, but there were areas of common ground, there were areas of alignment. Both of them did say that they were working towards laying the groundwork for that leaders' summit between Xi Jinping and Ursula von der Leyen later this month. And also they came to an agreement on Iran and an agreement to engage constructively going forward. Telly?
Many thanks for that report, Ross Cullen, live from Paris. Well, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, South Korea's parliament passes a revision to the Commercial Act in a bid to improve corporate governance standards. Plus, Japanese companies agree to raise wages by 5.25% this year, marking the biggest pay hike in 34 years. Hello again. You're watching East Asia Tonight, and it is now time for business news with Roland Lim. So, Roland, it seems like there are a lot of developments happening ahead of next week's worldwide U.S. trade tariff deadline. Tell us more.
Yeah, lots of deals. The U.S. announced a trade deal with Vietnam and removed recent restrictions on chip design software sales in China. We'll speak to an expert to delve into these stories deeper. Now, the U.S. has lifted export restrictions on chip design software to China. It comes as Washington and Beijing agreed on a deal to ease restrictions on critical technologies that were put into place earlier this year. 3 leading chip design software companies say the U.S. Commerce Department informed them that they no longer need to seek government licenses to do business with China. Siemens adds that they have restored full access to its services for its Chinese customers, while Synopsys and Cadence say they are in the process of resuming such services. Last week, Washington said it will lift export restrictions on chip design software, ethane, and jet engines as part of a trade deal with Beijing in return for easier access to Chinese magnets and rare earths, critical materials for manufacturing and semiconductor production. China's semiconductor shares little moved following the lifting of the restrictions. The country's biggest chipmaker, SMIC, down just north of 0.5%, while the CES China Semiconductor Index is down marginally. A trade deal has been announced between the U.S. and Vietnam, averting a threatened 46% levy. Vietnam, which has the 3rd biggest trade surplus with the U.S., now faces a much lower 20% in return for opening its market to American products. Observers say the agreement isn't about the narrowing of the export gap alone, but also seen as a strategic score for the U.S. to counter China in Asia. With lower tariffs on Vietnamese goods, more firms could be attracted to move their production to the Southeast Asian nation from China. Vietnam has also become a major supplier of U.S. imports, sending goods worth some $137 billion last year. And these includes imports of fashion and sportswear goods from companies like Gap, Nike, and Lululemon that were manufactured there. Meanwhile, U.S. exports to Vietnam were worth just $15 billion last year. With more Vietnamese goods lining the shelves in U.S. department stores, a lower tax regime could help put a lid on rising prices for the American consumer. Vietnam has also offered to remove all tariffs and promised to purchase more American goods. And this includes the recent signing to purchase some $3 billion worth of agricultural commodities. For more insight, we are joined by Jayant Menon. He is visiting senior fellow at the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute. He's speaking to us live from Manila. Jayant, good to have you with us on the show. Now, what does this new U.S.-Vietnam trade deal tell us about Washington's evolving strategy in Southeast Asia? Is the U.S. trying to shift containment of China to containment of Chinese firms operating abroad?
The shift of the focus on Chinese firms actually started under Biden. So this is, if you like, a continuation of that policy, the shift from made in China to made by China. But this reduction in tariffs, I think, is being overplayed slightly. Trump came out of nowhere and slapped on a 46% tariff just recently, 80 days ago. And now suddenly we are talking about how this is a great reduction. It's still a significant tariff, and we'll have to see how it turns out with the other countries in the region.
Which leads me to my next question. I mean, the short-term implications of this deal with Vietnam's economy facing this 20% tariff. Will it hurt its competitiveness in terms of exports, or do the zero tariffs on U.S. goods be enough to offset that to keep Hanoi in Washington's good books?
I think the impact on Vietnam's competitiveness will depend on how the tariffs fall for its main competing neighbors, especially China. Vietnam received a lot of investment from China and from other foreign firms when the US-China trade war was on, and China was specifically being targeted. Now everyone's being hit with quite substantial tariffs. So we don't know yet what will happen with the other countries, including China. And it's the relativities that really matter at the end of the day. So 20% may be a good outcome, depending on what other countries are forced to face in the US market.
How significant, then, do you reckon, is the US's move to lift curbs on the chip designing software to China? I mean, does this not contradict Washington's efforts so far in throttling Beijing's access to advanced tech?
The lifting of controls on software design is very specific, and it's in response to trying to get better access to rare earths and so on. The real important high-end chips by NVIDIA, for instance, are still being restricted. So this is not a blanket removal of those restrictions, but just a concession in the bargaining process, because the US really does need access to those rare earths. And so this is a concession in that respect. We really need to see what the US-China trade deal is, and that hasn't appeared yet. And that's going to affect not just US-China trade, but the rest of the Southeast Asian region, whose supply chains are still very much China-centered.
We'll definitely be keeping a close eye on those US-China trade talks. That was Giant Menon, visiting senior fellow at the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute. Now, South Korea has reformed its corporate governance laws in a move aimed at boosting the country's corporate market valuations by protecting the rights of minority shareholders. Revisions to the country's Commercial Act means that board members are now legally accountable to all shareholders, not just with significant holdings. Large shareholders are also reined in, with their voting rights limited to 3% when it comes to appointing members of an audit committee. Analysts say many boards of the country's conglomerates are dominated by the founding families, who have been criticized for artificially depressing the share prices in order to avoid the country's high inheritance tax. Now, as such, many companies tend to trade at lower valuations than their overseas peers, a phenomenon known as the Korea discount. The reforms are a win for President Lee Jae-myung after the National Assembly passed the bill with bipartisan support. Corporate governance reforms have been a goal for many of the country's leaders, including former President Yoon Suk-yeol. Expectation of South Korea's reforms of becoming more shareholder-friendly have been a major driver for the country's stocks. The benchmark Kospi Index has surged nearly 30% year-to-date and is one of the best performing in the world, maintaining momentum after today's vote to close at 1.34% higher. Around a tenth of Japanese workers can look forward to an average pay increase of more than 5% this year, following talks between companies and the country's largest union group. For more than 7 million workers, the average pay raise of 5.25% is the highest in more than 3 decades. The results of the negotiations support the central bank's view of an emerging cycle of higher wages and prices, boosting the case for further rate hikes when it meets later this month. However, real wages have only grown in 4 months of the last 3 years, as the country's core inflation rate, that stayed above the Bank of Japan's 2% target, which in turn has dampened consumption, leading to lower profit margins for companies, and that could potentially hamper their abilities to raise wages. Taiwan is doubling its lending quota to companies in hopes of ramping up investments in the island's economy as it navigates economic headwinds due to President Trump's tariff threats. Nearly $25 billion of loans will be allocated within the next 2 years, and that's up from the previous $12 billion announced earlier. Taiwan's government is also subsidizing fees for firms' loan applications, as well as the allowing of the hiring of more migrant workers under certain conditions. The loan quotas are part of the programs the government launched back in 2019 to encourage investment. And this is also the first time foreign companies are eligible to invest Taiwan programs. Taiwan's economy has seen strong growth bolstered by tech exports, but that is now a threat due to the Trump administration's 32% levy on Taiwanese shipments. It has since introduced support measures totaling some $3 billion, expected to create some 80,000 jobs. And that's the latest in business. Otelli.
Thanks, Roland. Time now for a break, but coming up on East Asia tonight. Could last month's strikes on Iran's nuclear program by Israel and the US signal to North Korea that it should be holding on to its atomic arsenal? Well, we'll be finding out when we speak to an expert in just a moment. And the Chinese vice premier pressing for deeper ties with the global south at the World Peace Forum in Beijing. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. South Korea's parliament approves a revision to rules governing martial law. It comes months after a sudden declaration of martial law by former President Yoon Suk-yeol. A campaigning begins for the upper house election in Japan. All eyes are on whether the ruling bloc can maintain its majority. And China has warned the EU against confrontation, saying the two sides are partners, not rivals. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi heads to Germany for a security dialogue later today after a meeting with EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas yesterday. Now, the recent U.S. missile strikes on Iran has had experts wondering what Tehran's close ally North Korea could learn. Now, as U.S. B-2 bombers streaked over the capital city of Tehran, there were questions on what message the move would have sent to nuclear-armed Pyongyang. Pusan National University's Robert Kelly, in an earlier commentary on CNA Digital, said, and I quote, "For anti-Western rogue states, the reason is, if you have nuclear weapons, you will not be attacked." And he added that the best defense against American or Western action is to nuke up and never denuclearize, no matter what they offer. Well, political scientists have also predicted that Washington's actions may prompt Pyongyang to accelerate its weapons program. Unlike Iran, Pyongyang possesses an extensive, fully developed arsenal of nuclear weapons, and North Korea was quick to issue a statement strongly condemning the attacks on Iran. During the attacks, Iran's key allies offered verbal support but refrained from direct action. Now, for more on this, let's bring in Andrei Lankov, Director of Korea Risk Group and a professor at Kookmin University. Well, thanks, Professor Lankov, for joining us on East Asia tonight. First up, I want to talk about, how basically with Iran's key allies didn't quite exactly rush to its defense during those recent strikes. And then when we look at North Korea's military and economic ties with Russia and China, Professor, how genuinely reliable do you think those alliances are? I mean, could Pyongyang really count on Moscow or Beijing to intervene if they were attacked?
Well, it's a big question. There is a difference, however, because Iran was not technically an ally of Russia and China. They have no treaty with obligations about defense, mutual defense, in a case of a foreign military attack. North Korea, however, has such treaties with both Russia and China. However, there have been a case in the late 1960s when it appeared as if a war was just going to break out in Korea after the North Koreans attacked and hijacked, essentially, an American naval vessel, Puebla. And back then, the Soviet side made clear that it was not going to intervene because it was a result of provocative actions undertaken by North Korea itself. So if North Korea is attacked, well, they can count on some assistance, probably more from China, maybe from Russia, but it's highly unlikely they are going to be attacked now. But however, if they are going to attack somebody, well, it is far more problematic.
Yeah, so then if North Korea can't really count too much on their allies in terms of direct military defense, what other strategies you think, besides nuclear deterrent, Pyongyang could be using to avoid, having the same fate as Iran and also keep their regime intact?
Frankly, I think they have been doing it for decades. And the Iran is just another confirmation of their strategy. It's another proof, not the first one, which tells them that their policy is basically absolutely correct. And this is policy very simple. Go nuclear and remain nuclear. It's, by the way, same lessons they could learn from the experience of Libya about 15 years ago. Same developments. Libya used to have nuclear program. It essentially exchanged it for some economic benefits. And then, well, Libya was essentially crushed. It was an internal revolution, but probably without an outside support, without no-fly zone and everything, revolutionaries would not win. So North Koreans are simply more certain that they should rely on their nuclear weapons first, and maybe some limited assistance from their allies. However, well, as long as they're having nuclear weapons, they are not going to be attacked. They understand it, and they have understood it for many, many years, because they have been working on the developing nuclear weapons for half a century, if not longer.
So we've seen what, the sort of nuclear arsenal that they have with the various launches that they have done. But in terms of air defenses, though, so the way Iran's air defenses were basically neutralized during the strikes really seemed to highlight some kind of vulnerabilities. So what about Pyongyang's air defenses? How sophisticated are they? And what lessons are they taking from Iran's experience when it comes to making all these investments in defensive systems?
I would say they will try to improve their air defense system, and there have been reports that they have purchased some air defense weapons, air defense systems from Russia. But however, probably it will remain their weak spot. However, their nuclear weapons, their nuclear arsenal is extremely well protected. Largely underground facilities, launchers which can move using underground tunnels. So it will be very difficult, even if the air defense system is completely destroyed, it still will be very difficult for any outside power to be certain about, well, destruction, neutralizing all their nuclear weapons. Yeah. Therefore, it's highly unlikely, I would say it's impossible that anybody, including the United States or whoever, will attack them.
So in other words, and that's because North Korea has this fully developed nuclear arsenal, which Iran does not have. So that means, in that case, the chances of U.S. considering a strike is very, very low. Is that correct?
I would say zero. Because it's an absolute protection. Even if, say, some North Korean leaders are killed, like it happened in Iran, if the Americans or whoever is in complete control of their airspace, somewhere deep in the underground tunnels, there are missiles ready to fly. There are cruise missiles ready to fly. And, well, everybody will understand that such an attack is going to be very costly for any attacker. So, well, I believe that the Americans or whoever are rational enough, reasonable enough not to do it. And for the North Koreans, it's a new signal, remain nuclear. And as a matter of fact, it's a signal for everybody that, well, if you want to be secure, if you want your country or your government or your regime or your family, if you're basically a ruler, be safe, you should do everything necessary to develop nuclear weapons.
So I hear that message you're saying. So ultimately, just going back to the responses of China and Russia to Iran's strikes, how do you think North Korea has recalibrated its own calculations based on what it's seen, Iran on the receiving end?
I don't think it had much impact on their decision-making, just another confirmation of what they have known. They have had very close relations with Iran for, well, since the basically since the early 1980s. And it's not widely known, but they were providing Iran with missiles when Iran was fighting with Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq. They were usually using North Korean missiles to attack Iraqi cities. Back in the 1980s. They have always done a lot of cooperative projects, but it was largely non-ideological cooperation. Because North Korean official ideology is a mixture of nationalism and Stalinism, and in Iran it's radical Islam. It's completely incompatible, but they did not care, they don't care. They have exchanges with missile technology, probably it's not clear, but seemingly with nuclear technology, and definitely with conventional weapons. And they will continue to do it, but frankly, it's nothing new. What happened with Iran is just another confirmation of something that they have always known. In their situation, the security guarantee of the country and the ruling regime, the guarantee of their power and their stability is, well, nuclear deterrence.
All right, it's been great speaking with you. Thanks so very much for sharing your insights. Andrei Lankov, Director of Career Risk Group and a professor at Kookmin University. Now, a senior Chinese leader has made a subtle but pointed jab at U.S. President Donald Trump's foreign and trade policies as countries count down to the July 9th tariff deadline. A Chinese Vice President Han Zheng told a forum in Beijing that tariff and trade wars will have no winners, and maintaining the multilateral trade system is key to avoiding disruptions in global supply chains. Tan Si-hui with this report.
Addressing the 13th World Peace Forum at the Tsinghua University in Beijing, where some 1,200 participants, including foreign dignitaries, international strategists, and scholars gathered, Chinese Vice President Han Zheng laid out a 4-point proposal on advancing global peace and prosperity, which is the theme of this year's event. He warned against what he called a supremacist hegemonic mindset, a term that's typically used by state media to describe the United States, while pitching China as a key force in maintaining peace amid heightened geopolitical tensions.
武力不是解决国际争端的正确方式，只会加剧仇恨和矛盾。人类不能重回弱肉强食的丛林法则。 也不能让唯我独尊的霸权主义大行其道。面对变乱交织的世界，各方应共担责任。
Mr. Han then took another indirect shot at the Trump administration, saying that tariff and trade wars will have no winners and unilateralism and protectionism will only hurt everyone. He pointed to the threat of the widening gap between the rich and poor, as well as the inequalities in global growth, specifically among developing countries as a result of such policy.
The forum features more than 60 foreign speakers, with half hailing from Global South countries, including Egypt, Kazakhstan, and South Africa. Analysts say that China wants to leverage the forum to deepen its ties with Global South countries, as well as to reinforce the narrative of its peaceful rise as a global power.
It is a robust reattempt or revival of the desire to play the traditional role of representing the Global South with renewed vigor due to the fact that there are perceptions that the US appears to be abandoning that role, at least from the perspective of some Chinese policy elites, as perhaps the largest country in the Global South. It wants to use its heft to represent the needs and wants of the Global South that aligns with its own national interests and agenda as well.
While Vice President Han was discreet, the language was less subtle in another session at the Peace Forum, with a senior Chinese diplomat explicitly calling out the US for stirring up conflict instead of encouraging peace. He cited U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's recent remarks at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, where he touted the Trump administration's peace through strength doctrine. Liu Jianchao, who heads the International Department of the Communist Party of China, told the forum that stable and secure external environment is essential for China's sustained development. He said China would not export turmoil and conflict, which will only undermine its own development, adding that history has shown that great powers relying on military strength to seek hegemony will eventually falter. Tan Zihui, CNA, Beijing.
Campaigning begins today for Japan's upper house election set for July 20th, with 522 candidates registered. About half the 248 seats in the chamber are being contested. Japan's ruling coalition is seeking to maintain its majority in what's expected to be a tough fight. CNA's Micha Ishida has more.
Japan's upper house election is taking place against the backdrop of economic woes, such as soaring rice prices and looming U.S. tariffs. And parties are campaigning on platforms to tackle these and other pressing issues such as seniors' welfare. The ruling Liberal Democratic Party, for instance, has pledged cash handouts, which has come under fire as a pork barrel policy. LDP is fielding 79 candidates, including former Health, Labor and Welfare Minister Keizo Takemi.
政権選択の選挙と言って過言ではありません。何としてでもこの選挙必ず勝利をして、そして我が国がこの時代の転換期においてしっかりと安定した政治的基盤の下でその舵取り役を自由民主党にさせてください。
Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba wants to win at least 50 seats to retain its majority in the upper house with his coalition partner. But there are doubts whether that is possible on the back of his party's defeat in the recent Tokyo Assembly election and falling public approval rating, according to media polls. The stakes are high. A poor result on the heels of the LDP losing its majority in the lower house last October could trigger a leadership change in the party. The opposition is gaining ground. The Democratic Party for the People is seen to be drawing away some of LDP's key conservative voting base, with strong showings in the recent Tokyo Assembly and lower house elections.
それぞれ工夫してやってるのは分かります。頑張ったらいいと思う。でも結論から言うと、国民民主党の政策対策が一番優れています。
Another rising party is the right-wing Sansei-to, which is seeking to attract ultra-conservative LDP supporters. Media polls also suggest growing public support for the main opposition, Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan. The 125 elected candidates will serve 6-year terms in the upper house. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
Coming up in East Asia tonight, parts of Japan, especially the major cities, are experiencing over-tourism. We delve into this phenomenon. And at the same time, scientists are warning against undue panic after a manga sparks viral rumors of an impending disaster in Japan, sparking travel cancellations. The world of football is mourning the loss of one of its brightest talents. Liverpool forward Diogo Jota has died in a car crash in Spain. He was 28. Local media say the crash happened near Zamora in northwestern Spain. The footballer had just gotten married 10 days ago. Liverpool FC says it is devastated by what it calls an unimaginable loss. The club is now supporting Jota's family and his teammates through the tragedy. Now, Jota joined Liverpool in 2020. He scored 65 goals in 182 appearances for the club in all competitions. He also made 49 appearances for Portugal, twice winning the UEFA Nations League. Jota leaves behind his wife and 3 young children. Japan welcomed a record 36 million foreign tourists last year, and it wants more. The government has announced plans to attract 60 million annual visitors by 2030. Well, it hopes that growing the tourism sector will help revive its shrinking rural communities. But the recent influx of vacationers has already attracted domestic backlash and complaints of over-tourism. Insight, CNA's weekly current affairs program, takes us to one of Japan's tourist hotspots to look at this dilemma.
It's a rainy Friday in the historical city of Kamakura. Kamakura is home to one of Japan's largest Buddha statues. Here, you will also find the iconic Enoden train, a charming throwback to railroads past. Yet, one of the city's most popular tourist attractions is decidedly more ordinary. This railroad crossing in the middle of a residential district.
I love anime, and I do this anime that called Slam Dunk, and that's my childhood. And this spot is a part of the opening music of the Slam Dunk.
Actually, I don't know who is Slam Dunk, frankly speaking, but my kids like it, so I have to take a photo. This is the one my kids sent to me. So I guess this is the pictures that we try to take.
Slam Dunk is one of Japan's best-loved manga and anime series. This railroad crossing was featured in the opening sequence of the basketball-themed anime. It's now become a sort of pilgrimage site for fans, but also a cause of consternation for locals.
結構道路の真ん中まで出て写真をもうパシャパシャ撮ってる人がたくさんいたので、車でそこを通る地元の人からしたらすごいちょっと邪魔っていうのは失礼なんですけど、ちょっとなんでこんなに人がいるんだろうっていうので困惑はしました。クラクションを鳴らさないと移動すらしないってことがあったんで、そこがちょっと困ったなっていう感じですね。
それこそ6時から私は最近聞いたんです。朝6時からいるんだよね。ってどうしてって言ったら、どうやら静かなあの場所をなんか拡散されてる方がいるらしくて、人がいっぱいいないあの場所、それを求めるには朝早くしかなくて。
So, when does tourism become over-tourism? To measure the phenomenon, the World Tourist Organization uses a term called tourism carrying capacity. This is the maximum number of people a location can accommodate without destroying its physical, economic, or social-cultural environment or diminishing the visitor experience. Limits to an area's capacity could be due to physical space, as well as the availability of infrastructure and services.
お買い物に行くのと同じ場所ですから、鎌倉の場合は特に狭いので、買い物に行くところで観光客の方たちとこうすれ違わなきゃいけないわけですよね。乗れなくなっちゃったんですよ、私のところの路線は。要するにもうたくさん並んでしまって、朝病院に行きたいとかというおばあちゃまたちの足がなくなってしまって、
問題が深刻化する時っていうのは大きく3つの要素が重なってると僕は思ってるんですね。一つは急に来る、いきなりみんな来る。でもう一つはたくさん来るっていうパターンで、3つ目はよくわかんない人たちが来る、異質性。
The fact that there are so many people who are not Japanese filling these spaces and filling the hotels and filling the buses and filling the trains and carting their luggage around, that's something relatively new, really in the last decade or so.
So how will Japan sell its vision of a tourism nation to locals who are becoming tired of tourists? We have to catch the Insight episode, Tourism in Japan, Too Much or Not Enough, tonight, Thursday, 3rd of July, at 9 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time on CNA. And of course, you can also catch up on CNA Video on Demand or CNA Insider's YouTube page. Meanwhile, some airlines are cancelling flights to Japan due to a dip in passenger numbers after a comic book prediction of disaster went viral.
Scientists are trying to tame a widespread panic after a comic book prediction spooked tourists and even impacted tourist arrivals. Viral rumors have spread of an imminent disaster stemming from a local comic book prediction. The infamous manga entitled The Future I Saw was created by Ryo Tatsuki. Her book contains a depiction of a dream which shows a massive earthquake and tsunami. Tatsuki has sought to downplay the speculation, stating she's not a prophet. But many still believe in the prediction, interpreting her work as predicting the catastrophic event that would occur specifically this Saturday. Japan saw an all-time high of 3.9 million travelers in April. But according to recent data, arrivals from Hong Kong, where the rumors circulated widely, were down 11% year-on-year in May. Some airlines are even canceling flights. Steve Huen, executive director of Hong Kong-based travel agency EGL Tours, says tourists are shifting their travels.
對我哋整體日本其實都影響唔細嘅，咁真係可能影響到我哋有一半嗰個市場下跌嘅，咁相反地其他地方係做好咗咯，咁或者呢個都係契機嚟嘅。喺呢個時間，我哋擺多啲資源落去其他，咁但係日本翻嚟，我哋日本又做得好，其他地方都做得好，都並不一定係一件壞事嚟。
Some tourists and even frequent travelers are cautious after the manga prediction.
我諗對我嚟講嘅話，去旅行最緊要係安全啦。咁對我嚟講，如果有呢個消息嘅話，我都會盡量避免喺7月、8月呢個時間去日本咯。咁可能盡量會 delay 我嘅 trip 啊，可能9月啊或者大家後先去參加呢個 trip 咁樣。
But some visitors are also unfazed.
It's just a rumor, it's not a fact. And then Tokyo is known for earthquake, and we live in San Francisco, it's also earthquake. So we're like, no one can predict earthquake. I mean, I don't believe in the rumors, so that's why we're like, that's not going to affecting us. We're not going to cancel the flight. It's just a rumor.
Robert Geller, a professor at the University of Tokyo who has studied seismology since 1971, also echoed this sentiment.
The famous astronomer Carl Sagan, he once said that extraordinary claims should require extraordinary evidence. But these predictors are making extraordinary claims with the flimsiest of flimsy evidence. Basically none at all.
Situated within the Pacific Ocean's Ring of Fire, Japan is one of the most earthquake-prone countries in the world. But scientists agree it's pretty much impossible to predict an earthquake.
And that wraps up East Asia Tonight this Thursday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.